This is GovExec Daily, where we bring you the federal stories that really matter. It's May 15th, 2023. I'm Ross John Fortuna. On Friday morning, the Congressional Budget Office said that there is a, quote, significant risk that the federal government could run out of money in the first 2 weeks of June. The CBO statement reflects an urgency to get a deal done in Congress to raise the debt ceiling before the federal government runs out of cash. Across town, a meeting planned for Friday between President Joe Biden and top congressional officials was postponed, running against the urgency brought forward by Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen last week when she appeared on Bloomberg television.
If Congress fails to do that, it really impairs our credit rating. We have to default on some obligation, whether it's treasuries or payments to Social Security recipients. That's something America hasn't done since 1789, and we shouldn't start now. So we've not discussed what to do. If that doesn't occur with the president, our focus is on getting it done.
The unprecedented situation that this would bring is hard to predict. With the U.S. not being able to pay its bills that it has already agreed to pay, federal workers may be left working without pay or with IOUs or with something resembling a furlough. The U.S. credit rating will almost certainly be affected, shaking the world economy and, of course, upending the American financial system. As the date approaches, so does the unknown. Dr. Patrick Gourley, Ph.D., is an associate professor of economics at the University of New Haven. After a short break, he'll join the show to discuss the debt ceiling landscape.
Government was the top industry targeted by threat actors in 2022. Learn about this and other top cyber trends and insights in M-Trends 2023, the comprehensive report from the front lines of incident response. Mandiant offers robust metrics on types of attacks, attacker tactics, and guidance on how government organizations, from senior leaders to practitioners, should prepare and respond. Get your copy today at mandiant.com/m-trends. That's mandiant.com/m-trends.
The Treasury Department reached the $31.3 trillion debt ceiling in January, prompting extraordinary measures to keep the U.S. from a default. Now, this is a stalling tactic, and economic experts have predicted a default as soon as June. Negotiations around the debt limit are slow-going, increasing the likelihood of major disruptions to government operations and dire consequences to the U.S. and world economy. Dr. Patrick Gourley, Ph.D., is an associate professor of economics at the University of New Haven. He joins me now to discuss the debt ceiling and the economic landscape. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So what would a default mean for the government, the business of government, and the economic climate?
It would be, so one thing to note right away is this doesn't necessarily mean a default. So, right, there's this debt ceiling, there's a maximum amount of money that the U.S. government can spend. We've never actually hit the debt ceiling. And so a default right means that the U.S. is not paying its debt, is not paying the interest on its debt payments, and so on. So whether or not being able to issue more to be able to pay would mean a default, we actually don't know. All we know is that, okay, the U.S. has these bills they need to pay, and they're not authorized to pay them. But exactly what bills they decide to pay, it's going to be up to the government. It could be that they decide not to pay back some of the interest on their debt, and that would be a default. It could be that they decide, hey, we're just not going to pay any government employees this week, in which case it's not a default, and but something has to give.
So it wouldn't just be government employees, though, right? The bills that the U.S. has are fairly vast. How are those decisions made as to who to pay or who not to pay? Is that just kind of up in the air?
It's totally up in the air. So the Treasury Department or someone in the government would have to make that decision. But again, since it's never happened before, it's not clear what the practical purposes would be of reaching the debt ceiling in the days or weeks afterwards.
Markets don't like uncertainty, and this seems to be pretty uncertain. What are the consequences for the proverbial markets?
Yeah, it's definitely going to be bad. Right. This is, as you mentioned, markets really don't like uncertainty, and there's going to be tremendous uncertainty, right? And it's going to depend, if we were to hit this debt ceiling, what does the government stop paying for? If they stop paying government salaries, that's going to have a different impact than if they stop paying Social Security, which will have a different impact if they stop paying the debt. And so I think it'd be bad. And I think that just hitting the debt ceiling is only the first step, because this isn't a problem that just goes away. It's going to just build and build as the debt continues to increase, and we're not allowed to pay it. Then more and more things will not. The government won't be able to pay for more and more services.
So Social Security is something that you mentioned. Obviously, that is a political football of some sort, but otherwise, how would regular Americans, not just those who receive or don't receive, or who the hell knows, Social Security, what will the effects have on regular Americans?
I think you could see a risk of a pretty severe acute recession, and that's just going to affect everybody everywhere. If you have companies that decide, okay, I mean, there's many, many companies that are tied into the government, that depend on the government. If they're going to stop spending money, if regular Americans are going to say, you know what, maybe a vacation isn't the best idea right now, then you could have a pretty sharp recession pretty quickly, not just from the direct effects of hitting the debt ceiling, but also just the many ripple effects.
Timing wise, we got economic reports recently about inflation slowing, but summer generally is a pretty bad time for economic disruption. How do you analyze the timing of all this with regards to the broader economic climate?
There's no real good timing. It's something that shouldn't be a problem. The debt ceiling fundamentally makes no sense at all. This is money that has already been allocated to be spent, right? I think that there's some confusion over the debt ceiling and what happens when there's a government shutdown, and these are different issues. We have a very fraught process already of allocating money. This is the whole appropriations bill that needs to get passed every year. When Congress can't pass an appropriations bill, there's a government shutdown. This is another layer on top of that. So the government actually agreed to spend this money, but because of the debt ceiling, it's like there's some, dark, shadowy figure that says, oh yeah, you agreed that we could spend this, but this other group of people, this other Congress from years ago said you couldn't. And so there's really it really boggles the mind that this even exists.
Yeah, one thing I keep going back to when we talked about this, when we've covered it, is reading other people's analysis, and the fact that the U.S. is really the only country of our stature that has this kind of thing, and it's a constant fight, and it does seem to be these fights over budgets and things like that. So even in theory, what's the purpose of the debt ceiling? Is there a purpose?
Political posturing. Right. They say ostensibly it's to rein in government spending, but if that was true, you wouldn't have to raise the debt ceiling 40 times over the last 50 years or so. I mean, it's total nonsense. And both parties are guilty of this political posturing. A great example is that, right, in 2019, Republicans had, pretty much control of the main branches of government, and they passed a bill, or a budget rather, that was going to exceed the debt ceiling. And so what happened? Well, since they passed that bill, then the Republicans, without any complaint, raised the debt ceiling. Now that the shoe's on the other foot, now Republicans don't want to raise the debt ceiling. It does not matter who would have won the 2020 election, no matter what. If the U.S. government said we're not spending any extra money, period, we would still continue to hit these debt ceilings, just because as America ages, more money has to get spent on Medicare and Medicaid, and these other mandatory spending issues are going to continue to increase. So it really serves no purpose at all. It's just a way of kind of, I guess, creating some sort of political advantage, although I think it probably just makes people lose faith in the system entirely. So I don't even think that political advantage is there.
Yeah, that's something we talked about last week, about trust in government. These kind of fights, most, in my experience, people don't know the difference between the varying even levels of government. So it's just the government, and this certainly doesn't help trust in those systems. Do you think this is going to be resolved anytime soon?
Yeah, I mean, I and maybe this is me just being wildly optimistic. First of all, I don't think the extraordinary measures will run out on June 1st. That's what Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, has said. My guess is she's a pretty smart person, so my guess is that she's actually bumped it up a little bit to try and get people to move, which is what she should do. But between now and then, I'd like to think a deal would get reached. It always has in the past. Why I don't think will happen, what I'd love to see happen, would be just get rid of the debt ceiling entirely. It should not exist. It serves no purpose. And again, I want to emphasize both parties are guilty of this. Right? Joe Biden, a senator, voted against the debt ceiling increase in 2006. And he said he did it because he was against the Iraqi war. Great, be against the Iraq war. It was a total debacle. But right, if you're against the Iraq war, then you should vote to bring troops home or to end the war, not to limit the debt ceiling increase. And today, again, it's Republicans that are just basically being difficult. And it's like just a game of chicken that you're creating for no reason.
Yeah, there are real conversations to be had around the budget. I don't think this is one of them, unfortunately. But nonetheless, we're stuck in this limbo as we have been before.
Yeah, I want to emphasize, yes, have arguments about the budget. That's a great idea. Let's argue all day about how much money should be spent or not spent. But once we agree, and I know it's not agree, some people aren't happy with the budget that gets passed, but once a budget gets passed, that money should be spent. It seems, I don't know, it seems so obvious that it's embarrassing to say.
Yeah, it seems fairly simple that if you gave your word to pay a bill, you should pay that bill. And that strikes me as fairly obvious. But again, I'm not sure we live in a linear, logical world at any point, certainly when it comes to things like this. And as such, thank you for your optimism and for being on the show with us.
All right, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to GovExec Daily. Our show was produced by Adam Butler and hosted by me, Ross John Fortune. We want to thank Patrick Gourley for joining the program today. Our music is the song Signals by Catfish Dancing. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email us any feedback at podcast@govexec.com or hit us up on Twitter @govexec. Check us out on Facebook or LinkedIn by searching for Government Executive. We'd love to hear from you. We'll talk to you later.